Dear Heavenly God, we thank you for this time of fellowship. Thank you, Lord, for your people. And thank you, God, for revealing yourself to us. Lord, I pray for the preacher of the hour. I pray for your divine wisdom. Lord, I pray that all those who are listening, you may open our hearts and our minds, and all the things that are hindering our reception may be removed. I pray that you will help us to come closer and closer to you this day, Lord. I thank you for everything that you have done, Lord. I ask, Lord, that you will be honored and your name will be lifted up in this setup. In everything, God, only you be glorified. In the most precious name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Greetings. My name is Matthew Wesley Williams, and I'm proud to serve as a president for the Interdenominational Theological Center. On behalf of the ITC Village, students, faculty, trustees, staff, alumni, and allies, I want to extend a warm and heartfelt welcome to this first ever virtual lecture in the over 40 years of this lecture series named after our revered ancestral scholar warrior, Dr. Charles B. Copher. Dr. Copher served ITC as professor of Old Testament and languages and as academic dean, and was a pioneer in African-American biblical scholarship. This annual lecture is a sacred moment in the life of the ITC community. This landmark moment in our annual rhythm allows us to convene and dialogue around the research and intellectual projects of our colleagues, and to do so within the Afrocentric scholarly lineage of Dr. Copher. We're excited today on two notes. First, that Dr. Lisa Allen-McLaurin, Helmar Nielsen Associate Professor of Music and Worship, will give today's lecture. And second, that unlike past lectures, we now invite a virtual community to join us in critical reflection and dialogue with our lecturer and our respondents. Thank you for joining us today. And again, on behalf of the ITC Village, welcome to the 2021 Charles B. Copher Lecture Series.
Hi, Welcome to our 2021 Charles B. Copher Lecture Series. This is a ITC tradition that 43 years has been bringing scholars to share research and bridge some important venues: research, academy, life, and most of all, our commitment to engender and to bring life to our communities, to the Black Church, and to each and every one of our populations served. The Charles B. Copher Annual Factory Series was originally named the Annual Factory Lecture Series, and that was initiated all the way back to 1979. Dr. Copher, that completed his work at Stowe Teachers College in St. Louis, Missouri, was and has been for the longest time a central figure in ITC tradition, from pastoring to publishing several different periodicals and work, but most of all, impacting the very understanding in which Black tradition and the Bible intersect. And this is one of our most dear and important traditions that we vehiculate here. For us, it's an honor to celebrate the 43rd lecture series with one of our most esteemed colleagues that is bringing to us new insights and new possibilities in understanding a womanist theology of worship, recovering the power of ancestral liturgies of Africa in America. For us, it's an opportunity to confess and to bring the intersections of all these scholarships, the commitment and the understanding that as ITC is being called to be far beyond the mere transmission of information, our primary focus of theological education, moving from predominantly theoretical and philosophical concerns to the live-a-day, work-a-day problems of humanity. Just like our concepts of the doctoral program is being infused in everything of our work right now. ITC 2.0 returns our understanding that God and human beings to be to the center of our collective concern. This is important because we prepare leaders to become ultimately prophetic problem solvers, bringing together the Hebrew Bible, the ministry of Jesus Christ, and the best of African American Christian witness that are revealed and reveal the prophets that routinely denounce and challenge the ways in which we live in everyday life. Important work, important opportunity. In the words of my colleague, Dr. Mark Lomax, our degree coordinator for the Doctor of Ministry, to bring together all of us to imagine new directions for our institution, lives, and communities. So welcome to ITC. Welcome to our Copher B Lectures series. Welcome, most of all, on how we can bring together scholarship, spirituality, justice work, community work as prophetic problem solvers in our everyday life. Welcome to our lecture series.
Greetings. It is my pleasure to introduce our lecturer for this season's 2021 Copher Lecture, the Reverend Dr. Lisa Allen-McLaurin. She is an Emmy and Webby Award-winning pastor, professor, and public theologian. She is the Helmar E. Nielsen Professor of Church Music and Worship and oversees the Master of Arts in Liturgical Arts and Culture degree program at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And she is appointed coordinator of practical ministries for the 6th Episcopal District of the CME Church. She graduated from Millsaps College and the University of Southern Mississippi with bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in piano and music education. She also holds the Master of Divinity degree from the Canada School of Theology at Emory University. Dr. Allen-McLaurin is the author of the forthcoming text, A Womanist Theology of Worship, Liturgy, Justice, and Communal Righteousness, published by Orbis Books. She also authored Worship Matters, a collection of practical essays on the practical and spiritual discipline of worship, Creative Publishing 2015. And The Development Comes Before Deliverance, a 9-week sermon series and Bible study for pastors and congregations, Creative Publishing 2018. She is also a featured musicologist in the 2015 Emmy Award-winning documentary, Reflect, Reclaim, Rejoice, Preserving the Gift of Black Sacred Music. Dr. McLaurin is also married to Mr. Thomas McLaurin, and their blended family includes 5 children and 2 grandchildren. My friends, brothers and sisters, we are readying for an important engagement in music, in education, worship, and extended glory of our Creator. Thank you.
Good morning, ITC community. I am Lisa Alan McLaurin, Helmar E. Nielsen Professor of Music and Worship here at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and I am honored and delighted to be the 2021 Copher Lecture presenter. To President Matthew Wesley Williams, our interim provost, Dr. Reginaldo P. Braga, to our esteemed faculty, staff, and our beloved students, and to our larger community, thank you for this opportunity to share with you today research that I have been doing for the past year in preparation for a forthcoming text, A Womanist Theology of Worship, Liturgy, Justice, and Communal Righteousness. For today's lecture, I will be speaking on the topic, A Womanist Theology of Worship, Recovering the Power of Ancestral Liturgies of Africans in America. Before we begin, I would like to say a word about the term Africans in America. Africans in America is a term I have coined based on the work of Dr. Daniel Pierre Omotosho Jojomani Black, professor of English and African American Studies at Clark Atlanta University, and founder and curator of the Nation of Ndugu and Nzinga Incorporated. Dr. Black asserts that the word Black is not truly descriptive of who Africans and African-descended persons in America are. He posits that Black is a color, Africa is a continent, therefore, those of African heritage living in America are Africans in America. Let us begin. In 1990, Dr. William B. McLean wrote, quote, "Liturgy ought to reflect and relate to everyday life as Black Christians struggle to make sense of life, and worship ought to reflect a captive and alienated people in a strange land, a people in pursuit of liberation, freedom, health, and wholeness," unquote. Otherwise, ritual, and by extension, liturgy, is meaningless. What has happened to Black worship in the 30 years that have transpired since Dr. McLean penned these words? There are several answers to that question. Mainline Protestantism, whether historically Anglo or Black, is fighting for its life. Churches of every description and denomination or non-denomination are dying, and a divestment of meaning from liturgy, which is the inability of worshipers to see themselves and make sense of their lives in religious rites and rituals, is one important reason why. Worshipers lament that liturgies are boring, dry, dead, or static, and in response, worship planners and leaders look to incorporate current trends in hopes for revival. Unfortunately, even if these trends bring temporary increases in attendance or participation, rarely do they lead to worship experiences that result in communal liberation and transformation. because most of these trends originate outside Black worshiping traditions. Ironically, however, churches that remain committed to using traditional liturgies rarely experience communal liberation and transformation for the same reason. What theologies undergird the liturgies in these churches? Were they birthed from African cosmologies and ritual practices? Most liturgies of Black worshiping congregations are based on white supremacist evangelical models that focus on individual conversion and salvation, that promise to wash the believer, quote, whiter than snow, unquote. There is little, if anything, communal about it, and nothing political or revolutionary, so Black communities do not benefit. And in the last 20 to 30 years, these liturgies have become enmeshed with a prosperity gospel that contends wealth is good all the time, and all the time wealth is good. To be sure, historically, there have been churches and cults in the African American community that adhered to these theologies. But even many of these had social justice elements and communal understandings included in their theological teachings. What is being offered in many Black churches now is a watered-down gospel that offers cheap grace, a crown without a cross, Easter without Good Friday. This is manifested through liturgies dispossessed of justice, with little communal accountability. What is needed is a new paradigm for worship, rooted in African ancestral cosmologies and communal ontologies, that recovers African and early African American liturgical practices that, for Black worshiping congregations and their communities, have proven meaningful. A Womanist Theology of Worship, recovering the power of ancestral liturgies of Africans in America, examines the history of worship in the Black church in America, the enduring effects of white supremacy on its liturgical heritage, and proffers a new liturgical paradigm using a womanist hermeneutic. This paradigm seeks to dismantle problematic liturgies based in white supremacist theologies that have permeated Black worship in America from its inception through the 21st century. What is liturgy, and why is it important to Black worshiping communities? To begin this discussion, we first need to determine and define the terms worship and liturgy and how they are related. Interestingly, both terms have secular roots. The word worship comes from the Old English word worth-sheep, literally worth, worthy, and sheep, ship, and signifies attributing worth or respect to someone. Liturgia, from laos, people, and ergon, work, was defined in ancient Greece as, quote, a public work performed for the benefit of the city or state. It could involve donated service as well as taxes. The Greek New Testament uses several words which are translated as worship, but they are all verbs, action words. Womack defines and describes these for us. The first is sibomai, meaning to lift up or exalt. The second is proskuneo, which means literally to kiss forward and is translated to bow down. In biblical times, when a person would come before the king, she or he would bow down literally with her hands, feet, and forehead to the ground. In this position, the person could not fight, was in fact completely helpless. This position showed complete subservience and obedience. The third word is latriuo, which means to serve. The word refers to the hired servant who gives faithful service to the master or the person in charge in return for food, shelter, and money, which makes it possible to live. We have described liturgy as action, and perhaps liturgy is better described than defined, for it is not limited to a particular definition, but it is a word that encapsulates several meanings. The original Greek means work of the people, as stated earlier, but that work can be any work, not merely religious. The Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church states, quote, in the Septuagint, liturgy is applied particularly to the services of the temple. In English, it is used in two senses. One, of all the prescribed services of the church, for example, including the canonical hours, as contrasted with private devotion. And two, specifically as a title of the Eucharist, as the chief act of public worship, unquote. Dr. Melville Wilson Coston asserts, quote, the New Testament understanding of liturgy, which has suffered loss in translation, is that Christ's life, death, and resurrection are, in fact, the epitome of liturgy. Christians who claim that their lives are in Christ are formed and shaped by the likeness of Christ and are an embodiment of efforts to make present this one liturgy in all times and places, unquote. In his book, Liturgical Theology, Simon Chan describes liturgy as embodied worship. That is, quote, worship expressed through a certain visible order or structure. Thus the phrase order of service, unquote. Gordon Lathrop, liturgical scholar and theologian, agrees, stating, quote, the meaning of the liturgy resides first of all in the liturgy itself. If the gathering has a meaning for us, then that becomes known while we are participating in the gathering. The liturgical vision engages us while the order of actions flows over us, and while we ourselves perform the patterns and crises of this public work, unquote. Indeed, liturgy is a word that, when viewed through the lens of faith, encompasses these acts of worship that are participated in by a community of faith. Harmon Smith argues that, quote, liturgy ineluctably reflects, indeed, that it must mirror and mediate what we believe to be true and good and beautiful if it is to be an authentic celebration. Liturgy both reflects and teaches us the kind of people we are and are meant to be, unquote. And so as we hear these definitions, we take liturgy to be those acts in which communities of faith engage in to form them as the people of God. What then does liturgy mean in the life and worship of the Black church? In many cases, the word itself may mean little. In fact, when I polled my Christian worship classes over the course of 6 semesters about the word and its significance to the life of the Black church, about 85% of them stated that the word carried negative connotations. When asked why congregations held negative views of the word liturgy, most students stated that the application of the word to worship carried meanings such as high church, Anglo, and boring. This is not to say that liturgy does not exist in the Black church. Indeed, liturgy exists wherever worship exists, because it simply means whatever acts of worship take place in a given structured setting, however that structure may be ordered. Many worship contexts, particularly in non-denominational churches, pride themselves on being, quote, contemporary and or non-liturgical. However, whatever is done in that context is its liturgy, whether that is deacon devotional for 25 minutes, praise and worship for 35 minutes, altar call for 45 minutes, or preaching for 55 minutes. That is the liturgy in that particular context. And the misunderstanding of the word itself gives us some clues as to why worship in our churches has devolved into its current state. However, I do not believe that the presence of liturgy is what has caused the mass exodus of mainline Protestant churches. Rather, I think it has been the composition of liturgies and their origins. Liturgy is not the enemy, but rather our misunderstanding of what liturgy is supposed to be and to do. What is liturgy supposed to be? What is it supposed to do? Two additional perspectives on worship and liturgy, both from African American women, help us answer these questions for Black congregations. The first comes from homiletics and worship scholar Dr. Valerie Bridgman, who proclaims, quote, "Liturgy is playing with God. For me," she says, "liturgy is where our playful hearts meet the creative imagination of God, and God experiences worship while we experience grace, redemption, reformation, salvation, and wholeness. Worship belongs to God. It is in our play, our proclamation, our affirmations, and our repetitive recitation of the truths of our faith that we meet the God of all creation, God who spoke and still speaks. We play on the edges of eternity, seeking to know the incomprehensible, unknowable one. Worship, then, is an encounter with a playful God in a playing creation. The gathering of the people of God for this worship is an aperture, an opening in the midst of ordinary life in which we slip the sacred completely on," unquote. The second perspective from Dr. Costin is that worship is empowerment. Costin defines empowerment as, quote, "experiencing and feeling freedom as realized eschatology in, but not limited to, corporate worship," unquote. These two frames of reference for worship and liturgy reflect unique aspects of personhood, psychological and socio-cultural contexts of Black worshiping congregations. There is limited scholarship on worship or liturgy from Euro-Anglo scholars that refers to them as play or empowerment, as defined by Drs. Bridgman and Costin. This speaks to deeper and different dimensions of communal perspectives of worship and liturgy among Black worshipers, both vertically with God and horizontally with humanity. What then does liturgy do in Black faith communities? Edward Wimberly, author and pastoral care theologian, notes that Black worship grows out of what God has done, is doing, and will do on behalf of people of color. He states, quote, "The quality of lived life cannot be separated from what the people do to respond to God's activity in the past, present, and in the future. The response of a community to God's activity requires work by the respondents," unquote. James Hal Cone, father of Black liberation theology, provides another perspective on how Black worshiping congregations operate liturgically. Quote, "The Black church congregation is an eschatological community that lives as if the end of time is already at hand. The eschatological significance of the Black community is found in the people's believing that the Spirit of Jesus is coming to visit them in the worship service each time 2 or 3 are gathered in God's name, and to bestow upon them a new vision of their future humanity," unquote. What we find in these words of these scholars who have expounded on Black worship and liturgy is at the root of what makes Black worship and liturgy lived expressions a unique experience. The core of Black worship and liturgy is communal action, dynamically expressed in relationship between God, individuals, and neighbors, focused on God's activity in the lives of Black people. How that activity addresses directly the lived experiences of Black people and affirming God's plans for the future of Black people. Further, it is the commonality of Black lived experiences that underscore these communal actions. Experiences born of collective horror, sorrow, and even joy in the face of seemingly insurmountable realities. It is not merely being Christian that joins us in the fellowship, it is being Black and Christian. It is affirming the universal theological view of God as liberator under the particular auspices of how God's liberating justice and righteousness operates in and through the lives of Black people. As Dr. Cone stated so succinctly, quote, Black Christians believe that the God of Moses and of Jesus is first and foremost the God of love and of justice who is ever present in time of trouble, unquote. How is this perspective of Christianity lived out in the liturgy of Black worshiping communities in America? One of the telling aspects of Black liturgy is the personal view of God that is present in all aspects of the worship service. Prayers, music, exhortations, and sermons all reflect a personal, reciprocal relationship with the divine. Moreover, God is moved to action because of this personal, reciprocal relationship. A second aspect is the communal call for justice present in liturgical documents and worship acts. Most denominational books of worship, discipline, and order in Black worshiping communities reflect a knowledge and understanding of Black history that inspired the creation of Black worshiping practices and later denominations in America. A third aspect is the communal identity. The ways that Black communities help how they as individuals understand and are inextricably linked is different in some ways from the ways other communities believe themselves to be related. Dr. Costin helps explain this concept. Quote, African American Christians share several common aspects of worship regardless of denomination. They are 1, gathering to offer thanks and praise to God in and through Jesus Christ and to be spiritually fed by the Word of God. 2, a common historical taproot extending deep into the African soil. And 3, our history of struggle for survival as African people in America, unquote. This common historical taproot binds Black peoples together regardless of which country or region of Africa from which they have been descended. The history of struggle for survival further binds them in a sense of kinship, born of a communal fight for our familial preservation and desire for justice. What we see from these definitions and descriptions is that worship is the inhabitation of communal space and particular dimensions of actions of the gathered community, and liturgy is the ordering of and participation in these actions. How is liturgy bound to justice? Since we have defined liturgy, to consider this question fully, we must define justice. Webster's dictionary defines justice as, quote, just or right action or treatment, the carrying out of law, and the quality of being fair or just, unquote. Therefore, justice is the doing of what is right, legally, or the act of fair treatment. What does justice have to do with liturgy? How does doing what is right or fair find a home in worship? The words of the prophets Amos and Micah hold an answer for us. Amos wrote, "Let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And Micah states, "What does the Lord require of thee but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God?" These are just two of the more well-known scriptural passages that proclaim God as a God of justice. The concept of God as a God of justice permeates the biblical text, and according to Nicholas Wolterstorff, has two aspects. One, the justice God exercises and expects God's people to enact is not retributive or punitive, but restorative. And two, the four groups to whom justice is always due: widows, orphans, strangers, also called sojourners, and the poor. In the biblical text, liturgical actions lose their authenticity when those who participate in the liturgy do not practice and struggle for justice. Thus, we see that justice and mercy, which are the domain of ethics, and walking with God, which is liturgy, ritual, and sacraments, are inextricably tied together. Indeed, liturgy and ethics are not separate, autonomous entities, but liturgy, which is everything the church offers to God in the name of Jesus, is authentic only when exemplified in lives lived in harmony with the ethical commands God gives and Jesus affirms. Harmon Smith notes, quote, "The gospel knows nothing of sundering liturgy and the moral life. Or conversely, when the gospel knows of liturgy and the moral life sundered, it calls this hypocrisy," unquote. Hypocrisy, what a loaded word. And yet, this is precisely why many people claim they do not attend church or they have left the church. Because the people who do attend on Sunday act as though they do not on Monday through Saturday. Whatever the Black church was at its inception, it was about justice and remaining true to its African heritage. Gaylord Wilmore asserts, quote, "This Black folk religion contained a definite moral judgment against slavery and a clear legitimation of resistance to injustice. It was the slaves' African past that did most to influence their style of religious life, their rejection of the spiritual and political despotism of whites, and made the most important contribution to the Black Christian radicalism of the 19th century," unquote. Living into this fullness, especially in light of African ancestral worshiping traditions, means bringing one's full self to worship. There could be no authentic worship where there was a dichotomy between sacred and secular. Even though the Black church is not a monolithic entity, its development, particularly in the United States of America, has common threads, including an understanding that one cannot worship God in spirit and truth and live two separate lives, private and public. Our worship, particularly through the mid-20th century, was lived out in community on a daily basis. The Black church, therefore, was involved in every segment of life: education, health, economics, and familial concerns. Indeed, there were few aspects of daily life, if any, that were not addressed by the church. Does that mean that the Black church dealt with every issue in liberative ways? No. It wrestled with issues of women in leadership, class distinctions based on skin tone and economic status, and the general non-affirmation of same gender-loving persons, just as many Black congregations still do today. Further, the abandonment of the sacred cosmos as a cosmological worldview and the adoption of doctrinal beliefs based on Greek dualities of flesh and spirit led to spiritual double-mindedness and the divestment of justice from liturgy in Black worship that continues even now in many churches. Does the Black church still equate liturgy with justice? Is the ancestral commitment to fight for Black preservation still present in and through weekly worship and liturgies? If so, why has attendance among many Black congregations declined so drastically, especially in mainline Protestant churches that were founded on principles of liberation and justice? Often, responses to this question relate to worship styles. Worship in our church is boring. We don't sing the type of music young people want to hear. Why does our church have to follow the same order of worship every week? While the issues of attendance and religious identity run deeper than mere stylistic preferences, these responses are quite revealing. The core issue here, though, is not the style of worship, but whether members or prospective members believe the church is truly meeting their spiritual needs. And even churches with thousands of members may not be tapping into the spiritual or material needs of their congregations. There is a misconception in our society that the larger the crowd, the more substantive the product or presentation. That is a false equivalency that leads many astray. Often people follow and become part of a crowd because they feel their needs are being met. However, many Black communities are still dying, whether they reside just outside a mainline church or non-denominational church. What does it mean then that persons are sitting inside 10,000, 20,000 member churches with lit worship? Do these worship models and liturgies serve anyone besides the persons inside? Do they even serve the persons inside? And so often these models and resulting liturgies are focused on personal salvation and restoration. The focus is getting healed and delivered personally, not communally, which is reflected in the liturgy, the music, prayers, scripture readings, and preaching. These models have made their way into denominational churches because clergy and worship leaders perceive them to be successful in attracting people. Interestingly, these models do not fit the liturgies of piety and evangelicalism most often found in denominational churches, much less African liturgies based on concepts of sacred cosmos and kinship. This is why many churches in Black America are dying, because every week attendees engage in liturgical schizophrenia. It is easy to understand why these models and liturgies, while perhaps creating feel-good moments, rarely result in actual transformation individually or communally. Who are we? What exactly is, quote, the Black church? The Black church emerged from the invisible institution, which was birthed out of the necessity for enslaved persons to experience authentic worship of God. Contrary to prevailing and yet mistaken ideas about Africans who were immorally imported to the Americas and elsewhere, Africans worshiped God before they came to these shores. Indeed, in his monumental research for the book Concepts of God in Africa, eminent scholar John Mbiti studied African peoples throughout the continent and reported that, quote, in all these societies, without a single exception, people have a notion of God, unquote. African cosmological worldviews undergirded every aspect of the lives of her people and served as foundation for the creation of Black worship in the New World. Scholars have noted several of these worldviews held in common of many, if not most, African nations. The first worldview that serves as a point of departure is the belief in one supreme God, known across countries and cultures by many names. who serves as the high God in a monarchical polytheism with lesser deities. Mbidi writes, quote, God is outside and beyond his creation. On the other hand, he is personally involved in his creation so that it is not outside of him or his reach. God is thus simultaneously transcendent and immanent, unquote. A second worldview is the expression of communal solidarity in a system of relatedness known as kinship. The African concept of kinship does not extend merely horizontally to one's immediate family or close extended family, but also includes a vertical kinship with ancestors. Though some have disparaged African veneration as ancestor worship, Africans and African descended peoples know that because ancestors are those who showed themselves during earthly existence to be helpful, they are still deserving of honor and respect. Moreover, Africans believe ancestors have a collective power that energizes the living and infuses daily life. Respect for nature as God's sacred creation is a third worldview that undergirds an African way of life. Mbidi notes that Africans associate animals and plants with the concept of God and often consider them sacred. Further, the heavens carry God meaning along with weather phenomena such as rain, storms, and earthquakes. The entire universe exists in witness to God's power and beauty through sign and symbol. Therefore, humanity must respect nature as God's good gift and live holistically in harmony with it. A fourth African worldview that is both foundational and formational to Black worship is African wisdom, the creation and use of proverbs and folklore. As with the proverbs contained in the Hebrew scriptures, African proverbs are not attributed to any one source or elder. They exist as the wisdom of the nation. These narratives contain and communicate a people's traditions, belief systems, and stories of origin regarding God and creation. What many scholars posit regarding the development of Black worship practices and the theologies that undergird them is a syncretization of African beliefs and practices with European Christianity and folk religion that emerged out of the experience of enslavement. African roots infuse the theological and liturgical foundations of Black worship. Cosmological views of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit that reflect African ancestral beliefs and practices helped shape and form the inception of Black religion in North America. Concepts of kinship, sacred cosmos, and folklore permeated the communal world of Africans in America and were evidenced in the development of religious traditions during the antebellum period. How did burgeoning theological beliefs about the Christian God and Christianity itself influence the development of liturgical practices in antebellum America? Were these practices direct descendants of African rites and rituals? And if so, how did these practices differ because of new or syncretized beliefs? Moreover, how did the environment in which they were birthed impact how they were practiced? The most impactful occurrence in the development of Black worship and liturgical practices during the antebellum period was the emergence of the invisible institution. As a way of countering the hypocritical and thus inauthentic messages and mold of white Christianity they experienced in slave-owner churches, enslaved Africans in America held their own secret gatherings where they did not have to ascribe to the white man's God nor his beliefs of Black inferiority. They could incorporate aspects of their African heritage and belief systems into the Christian worship they had witnessed in the white man's churches. Thus, an Africanized Christianity was born, what Mikhail Sobel calls, quote, a unique interaction between the white Baptist worldview and the Black African American worldview, resulting in a new Black or Afro-Baptist sacred cosmos, unquote. According to W.E.B. Du Bois, three things characterize the religion of the slave: the preacher, the music, and the frenzy. He describes these elements as, quote, born on American soil, but sprung from African forests, unquote. Though Du Bois' focus in the essay of the Faith of Our Fathers was not the development of liturgy in Black religious spaces, he provided the ground on which other scholars began to build a foundation of Black liturgical practice. Preaching, music, and ecstatic expressions of the spirit in antebellum Black worship environments emerged from the common historical taproot of African consciousness and cosmology, and were forged in the fires of daily experiences of inhumanity endured by the enslaved. Liturgical practices of Africans in America in the invisible institution were born of African ancestry and evolved in the crucible of antebellum enslavement. The overarching elements of indigenous Black worship included call to worship, prayer, preaching, music, and shouting. What would have made enslaved Africans decide to worship or engage in a religious practice in a particular way? I contend it was because, in spite of the circumstances they found themselves, Africans in America still believed in the power and efficacy of their gods and held enough experiential memory of rites and rituals to summon their presence and assistance. Though many of them accepted Christianity, however begrudgingly, slaveholders would have been surprised to know that Africans in America conflated the Christian God with the identities and attributes of African gods. The religious practices in which they engaged were imbued with Africanisms, retentions that survived across continents and centuries, lived and live within African and African-descended rituals and liturgical practices in North America. Religious rituals and worship experiences of Africans in America, no matter how extemporaneous or planned, followed certain African ritual and worship patterns. Scholar Theophilus Smith defines and discusses ritual and its prominent place in African and African-descended cultures in North America. He writes, quote, ritual is a primal and primary mode of social interaction and performance. In operation, it either precedes ideation, articulation of concepts, and symbolic expression, as in myth, poetry, or theater, or subordinates these as means in its patterning of action, unquote. Smith notes ecstatic worship or spirit possession and conjure as two ritual strategies of Black people in North America. The understanding of ritual as strategy in African culture is affirmed by scholar Naya Tarior, who states, quote, rituals also help Africans to accept the claims of society in the new state. Africans use rituals of life's crises to provide them with needed emotional support, unquote. The legacy of African ritual as a practice was evidenced in the ways that enslaved Africans and their descendants developed worship practices in the invisible institution. Homiletical theologian Jennifer Brooks attests, quote, the hiddenness of the worship rituals of the captive people exiled and enslaved far from Mother Africa was in direct response to the environment of slavery that had become their societal norms, unquote. The development of brush arbor or hush arbor worship, which became identified as the invisible institution, grew out of enslaved Africans' insistence on worshiping in ways that remembered African rites and rituals. The continuation of ritual practices in Black antebellum worship experience also evidenced the retention of Africanisms, even as enslaved persons espoused certain tenets of a new belief system. The music, preacher, and frenzy that Du Bois references and that slave narratives testify to experiencing provide a consistent picture of the survival and preservation of African retentions in worship. As the invisible institution grew into the Black church, how were the elements of worship, call to worship, praying, testimony, singing, preaching, shouting, and conversion codified into liturgies? What we find historically is that these elements of worship became ritualized or formalized as particular acts of worship concomitantly with the development of visible worship, first in praise houses and then larger formal church edifices. Whereas the practices and purposes of African rituals may have centered around the high God, intermediaries, and or ancestors, and may have been to achieve some particular tangible sign, message, or reward, Costin states, quote, ritual action in the Christian community of faith is founded on actions and words of Jesus, which are imbued with hope, fulfillment, and the essence of the gospel message, unquote. What theologies undergirded the development or evolution of these rituals and worship practices? How did they impact and influence the development of liturgies in independent Black congregations during and following emancipation? The two dominant theological movements during this time were Calvinism and Anglicanism. The established Calvinist churches, Presbyterian and Congregationalist, followed a Puritan theological tradition, and the Episcopalian churches followed an Anglican tradition. Puritan and Anglican theological traditions, however, were based on highly problematic doctrines and prevailing beliefs, including anti-Blackness, visible and divine superiority, and white paternalism. New England Puritans believed that whites were called by God to be masters and Blacks to be slaves. They believed that whites who were Puritans possessed saved souls and Blacks possessed damned souls. Joseph Washington remarked, quote, Puritans had the truth and were the light, and in Africans they virtually saw only blackness, unquote. This correlation of blackness with evil grew out of the Puritan notion of the devil, whose color was always described as black. Because of their disdain of blackness, Puritans and most other whites during this period perceived themselves as racially superior. William Meade, bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church in Virginia during the early 19th century, was one of the leading champions of Christianizing Africans in America. A slaveholder himself, Meade believed Africans much more suited to evangelization than Native Americans, but still identified them as savages. Like Cotton Mather and other white religious leaders, Meade maintained that whites were superior to those of Black and brown hue, and therefore had the right to subjugate lesser humans for economic benefit. Moreover, English colonists believed that they inherited Christianity through their bloodlines, further undergirding their contention of racial superiority. This fueled a theological premise Rebecca Getz coined as hereditary heathenism, quote, the notion that Indians and Africans could never become Christian, unquote. Puritans and Anglicans did not invent these theories of anti-Blackness. Historian Jean DeVries asserts that even before Europeans encountered Black peoples, quote, Blackness as a hermeneutic was able to grow and thrive in Western Europe, unquote, evolving from a theological, even biblical association of dark and Black with sinfulness and white with purity. Africans in America lived during these historical periods, and the resulting political and theological developments were saddled with navigating this treacherous terrain while attempting to construct their own faith systems and traditions, both within and without the existing religio-political structures. Some religious leaders of Black congregations superficially replicated acts and orders of worship from Eurocentric services with which they were familiar. Others fully adopted theological and doctrinal tenets of Calvinist, Puritan, and/or Anglican descended denominations and ordered worship services accordingly. The fallout of these decisions included losses and even negation of African heritage and Afrocentrism. Not only were performances of Africanisms or African retentions strongly discouraged or forbidden in many Black churches, African cosmological understandings of creator, spirit, and community often were abandoned in favor of Eurocentric ideologies, especially the adoption of much more individualistic, private, and economic understandings of Christianity. Wrestling with these dichotomous perceptions, coupled with the internalization of anti-Blackness theories, led to the development of a double consciousness in many Black communities regarding self, community, and worship. Significant to the development of liturgical practices in the Black church was the link between worship and justice. As noted throughout the antebellum period, Black worshipers engaged in acts of prophetic resistance as they prayed, sang, exhorted, preached, and danced. In the invisible institution, they developed a liturgical process that, while extemporaneously performed, held meaning and in some way was ordered to achieve maximum transformational impact. This process continued to evolve through praise house worship and into the development of independent congregations and denominations. Through each stage of development, worship continued to be tied to the immediacy of Black life. Whatever was happening to Black people would be addressed in some way in Black worship. The link between liturgical practices and justice was not a new phenomenon on American shores, but a retention of African cosmological worldviews centered around divine relationality and kinship. Despite efforts by human traffickers and slaveholders to divide and conquer African humanity, Africans in America devised methods of communication, and as they learned ways of surviving in the New World, began to recreate the bonds of community as best they could. Worship became important, if not integral, to the formation of communal identity once enslaved persons were able to gather in their own spaces. This is not to suggest that every enslaved or free Black person attended worship in any space. However, once slaveholders began to catechize Africans in America, many were drawn to Christianity as a way of becoming free, literally or metaphorically. The cause for freedom and deliverance through Black liturgies in Black worship spaces found expression in historical movements that happened as Africans in America took initiative to change racial and economic status quos and reacted to the ongoing domestic terrorism of white supremacy. These movements included emancipation, Reconstruction, the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Migration, and the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. In light of the impacts of Eurocentric theologies, double consciousness, and evangelicalism on Black religion, worship, and liturgical practices across centuries, what now can the Black church say to the question, does the Black church equate liturgy with justice? Even if we argue the Black church is not monolithic, is there a preponderance of Black churches whose worship services evince a connection of liturgy with justice? Why is a connection between liturgy and justice significant? I posit three main reasons for its significance. One, because of the biblical mandate that connects liturgy with justice. Two, because this connection is foundational to the formation of the Black church. And finally, the link between liturgy and justice is paramount to the sustainability of the Black church as an institution. Regardless of theological doctrines or tenets, Black Christian churches generally accept the full canon of Christian scripture as sacred. The biblical mandate connecting liturgy with justice runs through both these sections, particularly in prophetic and gospel texts. Several well-known and often preached Hebrew Bible passages include the aforementioned Micah 6 through 8, Amos 5:21 through 24, and the entire 58th chapter of Isaiah. In the Gospels, Jesus speaks several times regarding particular acts of worship, including fellowship, prayer, offering, and the ritual of the Eucharist. Jesus, in each of his discourses regarding acts of worship and worship itself, focuses on the authenticity of the experience. Jesus, like the Hebrew prophets, warns his audience of the dangers of empty worship, the temptation to participate in ritual out of habit or expectation, the lure of public praise, and most detrimental, observing communal worship rituals while foregoing communal responsibilities. How has the prophetic voice of the Black church been sustained in current movements? In protests waged against police brutality, unjust legal responses, and white supremacist actions since the 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin, the Black church as an institution has not generally been centered. Watson Jones III, senior pastor of Compassion Baptist Church in Chicago, stated in a recent radio podcast, quote, "While you may have had many Black pastors and clergy who may have shown up at events, and you may have had a lot of Black people from Black churches who were at those marches and protests, from 2014 to the present, by and large, this has not been a theological movement." In a 2020 interview with Ferguson, Missouri pastor and activist Brenda Salter McNeil, McNeil recounted how young Ferguson activists took the institutional church to task because of its failure to address systemic racial injustice in the United States. Further, they railed against the church's culture of homophobia and misogyny. The leading protest movement since 2013 has been the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, quote, "a global organization in the US, the UK, and Canada whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes," unquote. Black Lives Matter was founded by 3 Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer. The link entitled Her Story on the Black Lives Matter website tells the origin and purposes of the movement. In the story of origin, there is a clear critique of institutions whose liberative activism performs and is performed in particular ways by particular people. In this case, Black heterosexual cisgender men. The Black church historically has functioned in this manner, from the staunch refusal to ordain women that continues to this day in some Black denominations and independent churches, to the exclusion of same-gender loving persons from clergy ordination, marriage rights, leadership roles, and even membership. Though women may now be ordained in many Black denominations and churches, they are still often subject to rampant sexism, including marginalization, exclusion from leadership roles, and sexual harassment. The Black church's failures to address the systemic ills of sexism, heteronormativity, and homophobia within its own ranks weakens its moral authority and claims of liberative activism. The link between liturgy and justice demands that the worship of a God of liberation requires that the liberative work done in the name of this God would be for all creation, in order that all might live into God's calling and purpose for their lives. Working to make the link between liturgy and justice for all creation evident and inherent in Black churches is essential if the Black church as an institution is to sustain itself. Black liturgy emerged from unique historical, cosmological, theological, and experiential origins. To understand, interpret, and articulate its multiple meanings necessitates a unique liturgical theology designed to address its unique identity. Developing a liturgical theology to examine, evaluate, and hopefully transform worship practices in the Black church requires a liberative, holistic ethic, framework, and methodology committed to affirming the beauty of the Black worship experience while offering a corrective for practices that are antithetical to Black life. I contend there is no more liberative, holistic, ethic, or methodological framework for this task than that imbued and infused by a womanist hermeneutic. Within the original definitions of the term womanist coined by author Alice Walker in 1983, there are statements that evince the liberation and wholeness inherent in embodying womanism. First, Walker is clear that to be womanist is to be Black, unequivocally and unapologetically. That in itself is liberative, for it makes no qualms about self-identifying in one's truth of Blackness. Blackness is nothing to be ashamed of or whispered fearfully. To be womanist is to be Black without compromise or accommodation. Further, to be womanist is to be a Black feminist, which is to believe that, quote, Black women are inherently valuable, that our liberation is a necessity, not an adjunct to somebody else's, but because of our need as human persons for autonomy, unquote. The words responsible and serious, as well as the phrase in charge, are requirements for securing liberation for oneself, as well as one's community. Within the second part of her definition of womanist, Walker uses the exact phrase, committed to wholeness and survival of an entire people, male and female. To be womanist means that one is dedicated to the entire well-being of one's people, including their existence. A liturgical theology that addresses the unique composition of Black liturgy with its varied worship acts and elements and seeks to ascribe meaning to it needs to employ a womanist ethic, hermeneutic, and epistemology as Katie Cannon, Stacey Floyd Thomas, and other womanist scholars have described it. A womanist liturgical theology would, 1, challenge inherited worship traditions for their collusion with androcentric patriarchy. 2, take Black liturgy as well as Black worship experiences as normative. 3, deal explicitly with moral, spiritual, and political purposes of constructed knowledge within Black liturgical and worship experiences. 4, dismantle rather than support white and patriarchal powers that compromise Black liturgy and Black worshipers' integrity and self-determination. And 5, create frames of thinking and ways of being that take Black worshipers being creators and agents of their own liturgical experiences and exegesis thereof as the norm. To accomplish these tasks requires a centering of African and African-descended cosmological and theological worldviews and spirituality, an affirmation of embodiment in worship without qualification, employing womanist hermeneutics in all worship elements, as well as a womanist hermeneutic spirituality of communal empowerment and agency. An absolute imperative for engaging these liberative, holistic, inclusive ways of worshiping and talking about worship is an unwavering commitment to applying womanist lenses to every aspect of these experiences. This means reading, studying and internalizing the four tenets of womanism: radical subjectivity, traditional communalism, redemptive self-love, and critical engagement in order to engage this liturgical theological paradigm with integrity, not merely as a superficial response to worship critique. It also means adhering to the use of intersectionality as a method for evaluating the multiple meanings and implications of liturgy and worship and the performance of each. In this new liturgical paradigm, womanist theologians are not advocating for a Black gendered God. That view of God is just as problematic as a white gendered God and serves to uphold and perpetuate non-liberative perspectives of God. Dr. Emily Towns notes, quote, "Our concepts of God either support the oppression of Black folk in gender-based, racist, classist construct, or they serve as companion and confederate to our struggle for liberation and faithfulness," unquote. Liturgically, then, this requires a divestment from the maleness of God, both in the biblical text and in our language about God in our liturgy and worship. Further, a relationship with Jesus calls us to work as co-laborers with him and community as partners, helping to dismantle hierarchical language of master and servant, as well as false piety regarding our roles in worship, and helps us reject the notion of redemptive suffering. In this new liturgical paradigm, salvation is not an individual accomplishment based on one's personal relationship with God, nor is the goal or prize of salvation a one-way ticket to heaven after death. Rather, salvation is grounded in the redemption of creation through Jesus' ministerial vision of righting relations between body, mind, and spirit. Not only does this perspective address and critique oppressive patriarchal theologies, it also helps dismantle the way these theologies compromise Black liturgy and Black worshipers' integrity and self-determination. To adopt this new liturgical paradigm means divesting our theologies of cruel, imperialistic, patriarchal power that uphold the sadistic idea that God required the death of Jesus in order to save humanity. How liberated and whole would congregations become if people no longer had to reconcile opposing views of God as loving and cruel? How liberated and whole would people become if they no longer had to wrestle with the notion of God calling for the death of an innocent man, which is problematic enough, but becomes even more so in light of wrongful deaths of innocent Black women and men each day in this country? These death-dealing theologies have wreaked havoc on Black churches and communities since their emergence, causing many to believe the cross they bear is a holy divine sacrifice because Jesus had to bear his also. Internalizing these theologies of atonement have caused persons guilt, grief, and feelings of unworthiness, which further exacerbate Black struggles with self-identity in a society that already deems us unworthy. Also crucial to this liturgical paradigm is a liberative concept of embodiment, which is crucial to Christian worship. First, because Christianity is an incarnational faith. Christianity is not based on a book of scriptures about a deity, nor is it merely a set of proverbs about how one should live. It is a faith tradition rooted and grounded in the life, death, and resurrection of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus, the Anointed One, who was flesh and lived on earth. Jesus brought all of his being, all of his growing up, all of his living as an adult in his full humanity with him. He did not separate his mind from his emotions from his body, or his body from his spirituality. Jesus' incarnation frees the world from patriarchal, hierarchical, and heteronormative notions of what it means to be divine and human. His life is an example of how divestment from these false constructions can liberate and make individuals and communities whole. Embodiment means that in our sacraments, we embody our full humanity as Jesus embodied his, our full Black, our full female, our full lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, our full differently abled bodies. We embody these as we come to worship and liturgy, and Jesus meets us in all of these acts in our sacred bodies. Last, embodiment is crucial in worship because it instructs how Jesus encounters the holy and instructs worshipers to encounter the holy with heart, mind, soul, and strength. Therefore, a liturgical paradigm that honors our full embodiment does not shame or exclude bodies and does not require anyone to divest herself, himself, or themselves from their bodies to be seen as God's divine human creation. A womanist liturgical theology must be imbued with spirit and a spirituality that manifests what Towns calls, quote, the womanist concern for physical and spiritual isness in the context of American life, unquote. This liturgical paradigm is not rooted in practices that center otherworldly perspectives. Rather, it is grounded in the material, lived realities of Black women and men. There is no way to separate the two and still practice liberative, holistic liturgy and worship. Womanist spirituality embodies the hidden wholeness, creative and resistant soul forces, and Black communitas of African and African American spiritualities within a uniquely inclusive, liberative, holistic spirituality and aesthetic for the doing of liturgical theology, primary and secondary. To live and worship in this sense of wholeness is not limited to religious conversations or the four walls of a church edifice. What womanist spirituality advocates is an inclusive communal ethic of being and belonging that acknowledges and articulates the full experiences and intricacies of what it means to be Black in countries, societies, institutions, and spaces committed to anti-Blackness, patriarchy, heteronormativity, homophobia, ableism, ageism, and respectability. To adopt or incorporate this spirituality into liturgical practice, then, cannot be limited to worship experiences. To be sure, it must infuse and inform the worship experience, but it must also extend outward beyond typical parameters of church business to community business. The Black church cannot be concerned only with the spiritual and material well-being of its members and not concerned with the spiritual and material well-being of the wider community. It cannot be concerned only with the quality of water in its faucets and fountains and not with the quality of water in the sinks and sewers of the community in which it resides. The Black church is called to care and confront empire on behalf of all who are oppressed and marginalized, not just those who are acceptable in the church's sight. The contemporary lynching of transgendered bodies ought to raise as much of an outcry and call for justice in the Black church as the lynching of Black women and men in previous decades and centuries. The contemporary economic pillaging and plundering of individuals and communities by those in power ought to bring Black faith community members to town councils, city halls, state capitals, and the White House to speak truth to power in the same prophetic tradition as Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Henry Highland Garnett, A. Philip Randolph, Medgar Evers, Rosa Parks, Martin King, Mamie Till Mobley, Fannie Lou Hamer, and so many other unnamed prophets. A revelatory vision of hope and salvation integrates faith and life in a context of struggling for faith and justice. In it, we come to terms with the realities of life for Black people in America and the world, acknowledging the feudal dualisms and incessant desire for consumption that constantly bombards us and with which we wrestle daily. This aspect of womanist spirituality presses us to reject these warring entities, recognizing them as unhealthy and unnecessary, and replace them with a liberative, holistic, apocalyptic vision of who God truly is and who we truly are as God's people. We are called away in this liturgical paradigm from the precariousness of unchecked individualism onto the solid, steady ground of beloved community, away from the separate alien territory exclusivity into the wide, welcoming hospitality of communal love, grace, and mercy. This is what the Creator in dynamic process seeks with and for us: intimate, sustaining, reconciling relationships that honestly name our struggles and shortcomings, but are ready to do the revelatory work of finding and creating solidarity with God's will for a new heaven and a new earth. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for being with us today. I thank you all for attending the 2021 Copher Lecture. And now I have the honor and privilege of sitting with and engaging wonderful scholars in the Academy, our own ITC scholars who are doing wonderful, brilliant work of their own. They have each been so gracious to read and to give their ideas, their thoughts, their comments on my lecture, A Womanist Theology of Worship, Recovering the Power of Ancestral Liturgies of Africans in America. Please allow me to introduce our panelists for today. First, the Reverend Dr. Maisha Itiya Kariamu Handy. Dr. Handy is a native of Chicago, Illinois, and is administrator, professor, minister, and activist. She is committed to the struggle for justice and liberation as a womanist scholar and practitioner. Her journey in higher education and through higher education began at Lincoln University, where she received a Bachelor of Science degree in criminology and criminal justice. After relocating to Atlanta, she received the Master of Divinity degree with honors from the Candler School of Theology at Emory University and the Doctor of Philosophy degree in religion in theology and personality from Emory University. Dr. Handy has served as both Vice President of Academic Affairs and Provost and Associate Professor of Religion and Education at the Interdenominational Theological Center, our beloved ITC, where she has been on faculty and serving in administration for 21 years. During her tenure as faculty, she has served as the Black Women in Church and Society Womanist Scholar and is the author of Fighting the Matrix Toward a Womanist Pedagogy for the Black Church, published in the Journal of the ITC, and is co-author of Getting Real in Keep It Real, Working with Today's Youth. She is the founder and curator of the Holla If You Hear Me Hip Hop Forum, a series that engages our hip hop generation, the church, and the academy in community dialogue. And she uses that forum in her religion and hip hop course, which she established at ITC. She serves as the founding pastor of the Rise Community Church in Atlanta, Georgia, an Afrocentric and radically inclusive ministry. Dr. Handy was licensed and ordained to the gospel ministry at First Baptist Congregational Church of Chicago and ordained as a minister of word and sacrament in the Presbyterian Church, USA. We thank God for the work, the ministry, and the beautiful collegiality of our own Dr. Maisha Handy. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Handy.
Thank you.
Next, Dr. Will Coleman. Dr. Coleman is honored to teach at the ITC. His most significant publication is Tribal Talk, Black Theology, Hermeneutics, and African American Ways of Telling the Story, which is a multidimensional study of the retentions of African traditional religions, especially Hoodoo and Vodun, among freed African Americans of the late 1800s through the 1920s. Dr. Coleman received the following degrees: Bachelor of Arts from Rhodes College, the Master of Divinity degree from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, and the Doctor of Philosophy degree with distinction in the areas of philosophical theology, systematic theology, and philosophy of religion from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. As a theologian and practitioner of African and African American spiritualities, Dr. Coleman has taught and continues to specialize in theology, hermeneutics, and African traditional religions. His passion for discovering, reviving, retaining, and transmitting African American spiritualities continues to inspire both his academic and personal life. Therefore, in addition to being an ordained Afrocentric Christian minister, he is also an African American Babalawo of Ifa and Hugan of Vodun. Along with the courses he teaches at the ITC, he offers a variety of both pro bono and private online classes in theology, metaphysics, and spirituality. And I can say as a student of his that he is an excellent teacher and practitioner of African and African American religions. Thank you, Dr. Coleman, for being with us today. And our third panelist is the Reverend Amber Louisa Lowe Woodfork. Reverend Lowe Woodfork earned the Bachelor of Arts in English Literature from the University of Mississippi in 2012. After deciding to serve the community through ministry, Reverend Lowe Woodfork enrolled in the Phillips School of Theology at the ITC and graduated in 2015 with highest honors, receiving the Master of Divinity degree with a concentration in ethics. Reverend Lowe Woodfork is currently in pursuit of a Doctor of Philosophy degree in English Literature, where she will continue her studies in the fall from serving at Clark Atlanta University to Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, where she has received a full tuition scholarship and will serve as a graduate assistant under the most august direction of J. Cameron Carter. Her research focuses on the intersection of Afrofuturism, myth, and religion in the writings of Octavia Butler. Reverend Lowe Woodfork is an ordained elder in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church and has served as senior pastor at St. James CME Church in Perry, Georgia, Mount Zion CME Church in Rome, Georgia, and the Good News Community CME Church in Lithonia, Georgia. Currently, she serves as assistant pastor at the historic West Mitchell Street CME Church here in Atlanta. She is a former assistant faith organizer for the New Georgia Project and is currently the director of faith outreach for Sarah Riggs Amico for U.S. Senate. She has served as faith consultant for the ACLU of Georgia, director of faith outreach for several political candidates, including former City Council President Caesar Mitchell, State Representative Keisha Waits, and Helen Zenobia Willis. Amber's pastoral and public ministry are rooted in liberation theology and social justice. Her sermons, Bible studies, and lectures always focus on public policy issues while highlighting the idea that social justice is at the hem of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I want to thank you so much, Reverend Lowe Woodfork, for being with us today. We have just an awesome panel of scholars, and at this time, I'm going to ask that each of them would give a brief overview of their writings, their comments as they have engaged the lecture. So, Dr. Handy, we will begin with you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Alan McLaurin, for the invitation, and thank you for your outstanding work.
I say.
So I will begin here in response to some of the questions, the critical questions and points that you've raised in your lecture. If liturgical practices are to be true to what you call the defined word of what liturgics is and what worship is, or true to the described reality of how that manifests, when accurate, it must be focused on the embodied work of the people and what it means to worship or to engage in liturgy in and through bodies. These are authentic practices that shape and form authentic people. I appreciated your reference to the work of Dr. Melva Costin, who says that worship is, quote, experiencing and feeling freedom as realized eschatology, unquote, which suggests that it must connect with the real lived experiences of the worshiper, which includes their embodied presence, which must also be empowered, invited to participate in practices of freedom. This is the Creator or God with us. That said, a womanist liturgy must first invite all bodies, all Black bodies, to participate in this embodied and empowered experience. And so we must ask the question, how are we including, for example, differently able bodies and shifting our language and our theologies around ableism? How are we engaging liturgies that keep in mind sisters and brothers who may have mental health challenges and different ways of seeing the world as a result of those challenges? Are we addressing ageism and the exclusion oftentimes of children and their very real innate gifts, African spiritual retentions that just show up in them, and their connections to the spirit realm? Do LGBTQAI persons in worshiping communities that are not open and affirming now have coded languages and have to have them, similar to the practices of the reality and the emergence of the Negro spirituals on American plantations? Who is worshiping in the brush arbor right now because we are excluding them from our worship and have become oppressors by our exclusions? And I want to go here. Are we having Transgendered Sunday, where we invite members of the trans community to come and to be a part of our worship? Oftentimes, instead of shifting our theologies and our liturgies to include all bodies and all embodied persons and all ways of being of the people, we chastise, we ostracize, and at times we excommunicate, right? And I can hear the people saying, well, does anything go? No, of course not. Does anything belong as a point of departure and connecting to community as children of God? Yes, absolutely. Second, the worship must make space then for bodily movements. And so are we returning in our worship to the counterclockwise ring shout? What does that look like as a part of our liturgical practice? Libations and other opportunities for parishioners and beyond to connect with and to honor and to speak the names into the atmosphere of their great ancestors. Can we embrace congregational movement and dancing as able and for persons who are differently abled as part of our worship? Are we returning to testimony opportunities? You know, back in the day, we used to call it testimony service, which were important opportunities for storytelling and truth telling and representing our reality. Are we reconnected to the retentions and the communalism of our daily life? Is our worship on Sunday connected to the summer barbecue on Saturday and the wedding reception on Friday night? Worship is often boring, as you mentioned in your lecture, Dr. Allen, because it is not engaging people in what they see in their everyday realities Monday through Saturday, as it relates to their social climate and even to injustice. This is why another trend and trick won't work, as you say. Don't just ask me to change my existential communal reality. And so the Black church must wrestle with the question, to whom does worship belong? Is it just for the leaders that craft it? Is it for the participants up front and on the platform? Is it for the full congregation? Is it the priesthood of all believers? Or the Spirit who abides and directs a flow of worship that can be hindered by strict agendas? Pressing hypocrisy here, which you raise as a point of why many persons have left the church, and as having shared causation, if people don't act a certain way on Saturday and on Monday, it is often because the liturgy of the Sunday worship disallows it and can be inauthentic in doing so because of not only its espoused dogma, but its desire for a way of being that causes people to fragment themselves or relentlessly aspire to a theological anthropology that is unrealistic.
That's
Then,
good.
there's also the exponential expectations related to that placed on church leadership related to theological anthropology and how we're supposed to show up on Sunday. And I think the Kirk Franklin situation with his son revealed this in very important ways. I'll stick a pin right there for the conversation. And so finally, a womanist approach then to liturgic and to worship, a womanist ecclesiology must take all of these considerations seriously if we are going to embody freedom in our liturgical practices. Thank you.
Ashe, ashe. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Handy. Wonderful engagement and great questions for our discussion. Dr. Coleman?
Yes, I say to Dr. Handy, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Allen, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'd like to say that the subtitle to your presentation is very significant for me. Recovering the Power of Ancestral Liturgies in Africans in America. That last phrase there that you attributed to Dr. Black is very powerful because it's like a libation. And when I first saw it, I began to think about our African ancestors, relatives, cousins who are in Africa that we'll never know. Our ancestors who are at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean that we'll never know. Our cousins and our relatives who are in Brazil, Puerto Rico, Cuba, other parts of South and Central America, and even here in the United States that we'll never know. So the phrase is so comprehensive and it's an invocation. Africans in America and Africans in Americas, these various places where we were dropped off. That's the first point. The second point that your presentation sparked in me on this aspect of recovery is, and Dr. Handy referred to it too, the bush arbor. How do we recover bush arbor liturgies? This too is very personal because on one occasion when I was interviewing my paternal grandmother, I asked her, "Grandmama, who was the first person that you're aware of who became a Christian?" This is significant. This was in the 1990s when I asked her this question. And she said, well, the first person who became a Christian in our family was Mama Hannah in the early 1900s. And she said she remembered Mama Hannah saying that her feet had been taken out of the miry clay, storm may rise, wind may blow, but nothing was going to stop her, and that she was coming through Legend. That phrase was important to her, that she was coming through Legend. And I wanted to hear that now, prior to that time, my family, quote unquote, was not Christian. This is Mama Hannah's the first one. This is in the early 1900s. So they were practicing something else before then. That's the significance. And then she said, Mama Hannah also told her that they had a ritual of praying in the bucket, that they would go out at night and that they would find a shed that they had, there was a shed they had built. And they would take a bucket and put it in the center of that shed, and they would put water in that bucket. And that they would pray in the bucket to be free. That's the significance that also connects with what you've said, that they didn't pray just to say hallelujah, thank you, Jesus, but they went under the threat of punishment and even death to pray in the bucket. And my grandmother said one other thing. She said that they could see us in the future when they prayed in the bucket. And for those of us who know hoodoo, we also know that the divination of the water, looking in the water, I mean, it's multidimensional, looking in the water, the ocean water, looking in the water, forecasting, etc. was all a part of the ritual. It was all inclusive. And it itself was a retention of African spirituality. And I also want to highlight that as I think about Mama Hannah, the first Christian in our family, I think about my grandmother, Alice Coleman Taylor. I think about my grandmother, Elizabeth Taylor. I think about my mama, Nettie Coleman. I think about the women who prayed for me when the doctors told me I was going to die, told my parents I was going to die. The significance of the women. It was the women who in many respects led the way to new dimensions of spirituality. We've forgotten that. I don't know how we forgot that. Well, I do, but I think I'll say that for our discussion. And then the third thing that your presentation calls to mind is the significance, and you know I've talked about this too, of recovering the divine feminine in our consciousness. The significance of becoming more aware, for example, of those womanist spirits, like Oya, the wind and the storm, like Oshun, the sweet water of life, like Odu, the womb of creation, like Oba, the warrior of justice. All of these, like Mawu, again, Nanabaluku, all of these presences that our ancestors also brought with them in those ships and in different ways in different ports. Reframe them. You were talking about earlier. You wish you had in the background the ocean view, Yamonya, our mother of the fish, our mother of productivity, our mother of life, our mother who's the source, our mother who traveled with us across the ocean. We need to recover that and recover it boldly, just as we're trained to think about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and a whole litany of Germanic scholars, quote unquote, in order to receive PhDs. So too, you're reminding us, we need to recover our own cultural knowledge and wisdom. And then finally, our own sacred text, the sacred text of our culture, for example, the holy Odus that tell us these stories, are just as valuable and in many ways, perhaps even more pertinent than the reinterpretation of an African text that we received under the aegis of the enslavement of our ancestors. That North African text itself has to be excavated and discovered in another way by us through our liturgies. And concomitant with that, we must rediscover the holy Odu of our ancestors. I think if we do those things, as you're suggesting, then we'll realize how ancient womanism is, how persistent it has been, and how necessary it must and will be. That's true Sankofa. Prophetic vision that is rooted in ancestral memory. And for that, I thank you for your presentation. Ashe, 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 and Ayi Bobo.
Ashe. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Wonderful, wonderful words of life and great information and scholarship for us to engage in our discussion. And now, Reverend Lowood Fork, we come to you.
Yes, thank you, Reverend Dr. Alan McLaurin, for inviting me to participate in this panel of folks I respect highly. And thank you for trusting me to think through these ideas that you laid out so greatly with you. I want to just read from what I wrote because I'll ramble if I don't. But there are a few questions that I raised after reading your lecture. Early in it, you write, quote, churches that remain committed to using traditional liturgies rarely experience communal liberation and transformation for that same reason. What theologies, you ask, undergird these liturgies? Were they birthed from African cosmologies and ritual practices? You say most of them focus on white supremacist evangelical models that focus on individual conversion and salvation that promise to wash us whiter than snow. While it seems that biblical hermeneutics that maintain supremacist evangelical models of worship may be an issue on one hand, on the other hand, my question to you, Dr. McLaurin, is how does the biblical text help to illuminate African cosmologies and ritual practices so that Black Christians in America see that these cosmologies are not demonic, quote unquote, and antithetical to Judeo-Christian mythology, theology, and Christology? If a synthesis of African cosmologies and ritual practices in Christianity is what you are calling for, then I'm wondering what that looks like and how in this syncretism do we avoid creating something that's offensive, distorted, and unrecognizable to our sisters and brothers across the continent of Africa. But if a womanist hermeneutic is the methodological framework by which the Black church can develop, as you say, liturgical theology to examine, evaluate, and hopefully transform worship practices in the Black church that affirms the beauty of the Black worship experience while offering a corrective for practices that are antithetical to Black life, and I'm wondering why are African cosmologies and ritual practices necessary? Can the womanist hermeneutic not stand on its own? Or does womanist theology and Christianity writ large need African cosmology, and why? I think it does, but I'm wondering why you think it needs African cosmology. Further, I question if African cosmologies and ritual practices are always liberating and rooted in political consciousness and social justice practices. In raising this question, I'm reminded of Chinua Achebe's groundbreaking book, Things Fall Apart, which I love, which chronicles fictitiously Nigerian life before and after European colonialism, which was undergirded by the spread of Christianity as the means of enslaving and civilizing African savages. Right? While Igbo Nigerians resisted European attempts to Christianize their towns and villages because they knew that it would destroy the continent, we must give attention to those who were converted to Christianity and why they willingly rejected their indigenous theological beliefs and practices for this newfound religion. David Holberg defines cultural violence as violence that is encouraged by the beliefs and traditions of a given culture and practiced upon its own members. It includes ritual sacrifices, punishments for crimes, and other kinds of communally sanctioned violence. Acts of cultural violence permeate Things Fall Apart, from Okonkwo's violence against his son to the belief that twins are inherently evil and should thereby be murdered, and the marginalization of those deemed ontologically inferior and therefore undesirable. Achebe's illustration of Igbo life suggests that cultural violence was a normative practice among the Igbo before colonialism. Holding these practices of cultural violence in tension with the narrator's question in the novel, how could such a man be a follower of Christ, provides a rationale for Christianity's appeal to a people steeped in their culture's theological belief system and spiritual practices. In my read of the novel, I argue that the communal sanction of cultural violence amongst the Igbo against the least of these, including women, provided fertile ground for Christian missionaries. I would also argue that those pushed to the margins of Igbo society readily embraced this religion and spread of its professed gospel. They did so because Christianity's focus, as articulated by the missionaries, on love and community, recognized the humanity of the marginalized and restored their place in society. Christianity provided many with the theological and ethical language to challenge cultural violence informed by Igbo cosmology and ritual practices. Again, I ask, are African cosmologies and ritual practices always liberating and rooted in political consciousness and social justice practices? Is the best starting point for a new paradigm of Black worship? Is this the best starting point, rather, for a new paradigm of Black worship? Or do we run the risk of romanticizing Africa? These questions are critical to your approach Further clarity is also needed in what is meant by, for me, what is meant by African ancestral worshiping traditions. Africa and African are broad terms. What are some examples of these traditions, and from what specific countries, villages are we pulling these traditions? You also raised the question, what then does liturgy and Black faith, what then does liturgy do in Black faith communities? To answer this question, you cite Dr. Ed Wimberly, who suggests Black worship grows out of what God has done, is doing, and will do on behalf of people of color. You also go on to cite James Cone, who also buttresses this point as well. Both of these arguments assume that the recognition of one's Blackness and a working understanding of what Blackness is are foundational for one's relationship to God and worship of God. Can you worship God then in spirit and in truth as a Black person without a racial consciousness? What implications does this have for people who are members of predominantly white congregations and so-called multicultural congregations as well? You state that the core of Black worship and liturgy is communal action, dynamically expressed in relationship between God, individuals, and neighbors, focused on God's activity in the lives of Black people, how that activity addresses directly the lived experiences, of Black people, and affirming God's plans for the future of Black people. The question I want to raise here is, and this is in my own research too, is African cosmology futurist as we understand futurist in our Western conception, or do we only get a construct of future from Jesus and Christianity? You correctly state that the correlation of Blackness with evil grew out of the Puritan notion of the devil, whose color was always described as Black. English colonists believed that they inherited Christianity through their bloodlines, further undergirding their contention of racial superiority. I cite this portion here of your lecture because it suggests that if the English and other Europeans inherited Christianity through bloodlines, then Africans adopted Jesus. Consistent throughout Black liberation theology, womanist theology, and of course the Gospels is a focus again on the future. Naturally, then, you mentioned the word future throughout your lecture and in conjunction with African cosmologies. However, according to Mbiti, time is a two-dimensional phenomenon in the traditional African setting with a long past, a present, and virtually no future. This is a consistent understanding of time among primitive cultures and is contrary to the linear concept of time in Western thought with an indefinite past, present, and future. Based on his research in some tribes in East Africa, Mbiti concluded that the African has no time consideration and perspective of the future. This is because the events in the future have not yet taken place. The Akamba and the Gikuyu of Kenya, two of the tribes among whom Mbiti conducted his research, have no adequate verb tenses to demonstrate references to the future. With this in mind, I would be careful to do two things. Number one, delineate the idea of the future as we understand it in the West from African cosmologies. And then number two, wrestle with what it means that by adopting Jesus, Christianized Africans also adopted and apprehended through Jesus the concept of future. With these two thoughts in mind, do you agree with Mbiti's suggestion in other writings of his that Christianity needs African religions as much as African religions need Christianity? And given Mbiti's writings, given that they were published mainly in the 20th century, what do contemporary African scholars say on this issue of future and time? In conclusion, the church must address these individualistic gospel theologies, as you suggest, and the idea of God as a personal savior. Further, revising our theological language and liturgy so that our theological imaginations are challenged, pushed, and stretched requires a more intentional and transformational relationship between the Black church and Black theological institutions like ITC. You aptly suggest that to adopt this new liturgical paradigm means divesting our theologies of cruel, imperialistic, patriarchal power that uphold the sadistic idea that God required the death of Jesus in order to save humanity. This means that even our preaching must change. Our interpretation of signs and symbols must change. We must critically examine our aesthetic obsession with the violence and brutality of the crucifixion. We must also critically examine, as Charles Long suggests, civilization as a myth and as a symbol. To do this, then the Black church, to borrow a term from Walter Earl Fluker, must be in the business of shape-shifting so that prevailing theological discourse and religious meaning, which are reflected in our liturgies, are not accepted as absolute. The task before us is to challenge uncritical allegiances to theological language that informs every aspect of our liturgies, that perpetuates violent myths about Blackness and ultimately maintains empire. As a former pastor, I can attest, and you know, Doc, because I was your student, right? And I served with you. I can attest that although liturgy is the most basic thing that we do, it is indeed the most powerful and transformative thing that we do. Liturgies rooted in liberation theologies and womanist thought that I've either written or adopted and revised have transformed the worship experiences in the congregations I have pastored. The members of these churches were empowered then to critique traditional liturgies and their perception of God. However, we are up against, unfortunately, denominational leaders who in many spaces have co-opted the anti-Black language of empire and colonial Christianity. Leaders who have a vested interest in upholding the violent mythical arrangement in which we are caught. Leaders who have no imaginations, dare I say. Leaders whose God is capitalism. Leaders who are responsible for the killing of our churches, and leaders who view Africa through a colonial imperial lens. Their mission is to save Africa, not work alongside African scholars of religion to address the ontological and epistemological problems of what Jesus means to African cultures and what African cultures mean to Black Christian worship. These are our challenges before us, and your scholarship is helping to equip us of the critical insight needed to address and face these issues. So thank you for your work.
Thank you, Ashe. Excellent, excellent commentary and wonderful provocative questions, Reverend Lowood Fork. I thank you for your scholarship. I thank each of our panelists for your scholarship. This is truly helpful for me as I continue to mine the depths of this research and this work. So as we begin our discussion, I want to use as a point of departure, Reverend Lowood Fork, one of your questions, and I'm opening this to the panel. And as it develops and as we move along, let's have this organic conversation. You ask, does womanist theology need African cosmology? And then you also ask, is all African cosmology liberative? Now, I would say, as a way of starting that conversation, I don't know about the practices that emanate from all aspects of cosmology, and so that is why I was what I consider to be delimiting the cosmology that I am putting forth for this womanist liturgical paradigm. But I'm open to hear what everyone has to say. So I'm looking at African cosmology as a way, first of all, of eliminating this dichotomy of flesh and spirit, of sacred and secular. Because I feel like, and I believe, Dr. Handy, you said something in your response about how that has been to our detriment in the church, and even as we think about what has happened with Kirk Franklin and other gospel artists, other pastors who have been caught on hot mics, as it were. But that also speaks to the average everyday church goer and how that person, how we live from Monday through Saturday in preparation for Sunday, or what we experience on Sunday in preparation for Monday through Saturday. And so then in my mind, what African cosmology has for this womanist paradigm, because womanism is committed to this wholeness, this holistic understanding of being. And so for me, first of all, this God consciousness where there's no separation of sacred and secular is what I'm primarily hoping would occur with this new paradigm. That is one of the things, this God consciousness of no separation of sacred and secular, but then also this understanding of kinship. But I'm going to open it up to our panelists for further remark. Yes, Doc.
Yes, so again, thank you, Reverend Woodford, Lord Woodford. And that's very provocative. As you were speaking about African cosmology, what came to mind for me is that I don't think many of us have actually seen what biblical cosmology looks like. In other words, if you were to draw a diagram of what's described in Genesis chapter 1 and place it alongside most African cosmologists, it is amazing how much alike they are. With the heavens above, the earth, air, the earth as an island, and the waters below. It's almost as though they're from the same blueprint. So that's the first thing. I don't think most of us have actually had the opportunity to see what that looks like and to see the similarities between Hebrew / what later becomes Christian, Igbo, Congo, Yoruba, and Dahomean cosmology is what they look like and how extraordinarily similar they are. The second point, again, that's provocative in what you said is that I think time in African cosmology is actually twofold. A, it is cyclical. That is why we believe in resurrection action in a different way, from above to below, etc. But it is also progressive, meaning that it moves forward, it's moving somewhere, and that it is organic. And for me, this is the beauty of it. Let's just take an example. In Ifa, the ethical goal is Iwapwele. That means the development of good character. So good character is based upon wisdom and observation of what happens in the macrocosm that is right. And how does the individual and community emulate that in their own personal and in their own communal forms. There's a parable that goes, you come from the other world or room in order to make the world better than it was when you left here the first time. And that you live a life so that when you come back, it'll be better than you left it. So inside of that notation is the idea that time is cyclical, but it is also progressive. It's going somewhere. And then just one other point, again, from your provocative comments, the notion of even the deity in some respects is that it's almost, not quite, but in some cases, almost like process theology, i.e., that the deity is engaged in a learning process as well, and that the universe is dialogical. So what is the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal from the ethical point of view is good character, which is based again on balance. No one needs to tell you that electricity can be used both to have a webinar and it can be used to kill. Wisdom is what determines the difference. Agency determines the difference. So in that respect, again, your comments are very provocative. And I just will add to that those notations that our ancestors, there's one other point. A, we're not talking about a template that we take carte blanche. We're talking about something that we actually can engage in and transform ourselves, because like our ancestors, we have agency. And we're invited to utilize that agency individually and corporately. I'll pause there, but thank you for the question.
No, thank you for your response. I'm glad you made the comment about the overt similarities, right, between biblical cosmology and various African ones. Like, that was my entire point, is that in making this, not comparison, but pulling from these cosmologies, right, we got to show folks that this is not antithetical to what we do and practice already, right? How can we help folks to see that the ways in which we have demonized the, all things Black, right, from the continent,
And particularly African.
Exactly. It comes from this white imagination, right? That, set out to signify us as evil, as inherently less than, right? And so Doc, you made a point in your lecture about millennials who want to engage, right, these cosmologies more in worship. And I'm one of those persons, right? But at the same time, there are still so many of us who I see on my timeline every single day around my age group, right? Who I went to school with, who are learned people, right? Who still demonize all things African, right? Because they think it's not compatible with the text. And it takes a lot of work and re-education, right? And decolonization to help folks to see that, okay, these things are not at all dissimilar, so it's a lot of work.
I'll share.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. I love you.
I wanted to connect with a few of these points. And first, this notion of agency, right? Agency and legitimacy. We often say that we are embodying new African ways, right? Which I think is resonant with the phrase Africans in America. And so I think that, first of all, we have to be able to firmly stand there and say, we don't have to argue our legitimacy either to African contexts or to white ones, to either context, right? It's not, I don't even want to think about it as assimilation or appropriation. It's retention, and it's who we are, even as we have evolved in this context. And we have agency, and I think we have a right to construct new ways of being, new liturgies, new ways of worship that blend all of who we are and where we've been. So I just wanted to say that on the front end, because of course, we hear the arguments about, okay, when you say Africa, which African country are you referring to? Which African tradition, right? And that's a legitimate question, but in ways it's not, because you're asking that question of people who have not been afforded, most of us, the opportunity to even discover who we are and where we come from, specifically, right? And so, we up in here surviving and thriving and creating. Out of all that we can tap into. So I wanted to say that. But then secondly, I also wanted to say in response to the question about womanism and African cosmology, if you look at Alice Walker's original definition of womanism, which is in the lecture, it's reflective of African cosmology. It's reflective of wholeness, right? And of embracing inclusively all of what it means to be a womanist and all of the community, right? It's pushing against, I think, the dichotomies of sacred and secular. Loves food, loves roundness, loves the people. That's not just on Saturday, that's on Sunday too.
Right.
That's correct.
That's right.
24/7, right? And so I'm pushing this embodiment thing again, because it's just something that I've always pressed and been thinking on for a few years now, right? What does it mean to love roundness in worship? We know what it means to love food, at least after worship.
That's correct. Come on with that fried chicken.
That chicken, right?
Yes.
That's correct.
To love the moon.
That's good. Stay right there, Doc. Let's press that embodiment right now. So then how do we engage, you as a pastor, Reverend Woodford, Dr. Coleman, as a pastor, how do we press embodiment in worship for folk who have been taught that the flesh is evil?
We take them back to the go ahead. We take them back just to one idea that in Genesis, for example, that great Hebrew passage that the Elohim, the strong ones, made specifically Adam, not a man, Adam, the human being, Zachar nechava, as male and female. And specifically, this is what's beautiful about it. If you look at the Hebrew, it specifically is referring to their procreative powers, that in their procreative powers, they're in the image of the divine powers. And then that kind of that refrain is tweaked and says it is tov me'od. Not that it's just good. This is very good. So the embodiment, what we call the imago Dei, really is in the image of the powers, and in our creative, procreative powers, we are very good. We're very good.
Yes, and I want to add to that, Dr. Coleman. When I think about embodiment and this false dichotomy, right, between flesh and spirit, and the idea that one's flesh is evil, all that nonsense, right? I'm a preacher. I go right to Jesus, because Jesus, God chose to embody this brown person, right? This African person, this poor person, all the things, right? All the negations, all the ways that one can be marginalized. Like, God chose to embody God's self in that. God chose to embody God's self in that around people who were very similar to that, right? In various ways. And so when I think of embodiment and this foolishness that we are caught up in, right? This flesh and spirit nonsense, I think about who God chose to embody, right? And whose body, and this brings up, a different issue, but still, whose body this person came to us through. This body did not come to us already made, right? It came to us through a woman, through a woman, right? And so, and I think about, Doc, my background is literature. My mind also goes right to Baby Suggs and
That's
Beloved.
where I was going. That's
Amen.
it.
Listen, Baby Suggs will help you all if you let her, because she is embodying again this idea that your flesh is good, no matter what whiteness and the myths of whiteness tells us, right? The flesh is good. And so she says, out there, and it's holy, right? It's sacred. And out there, they don't love your flesh, right? They don't love your hands or your neck, so love and embrace yourself, right? Kiss yourself, all that good stuff, right? She's doing that even outside the walls of a church. She's doing that outside of an institution that wouldn't accept probably her calling as a preacher, right? And so that is womanist, preaching and teaching to love ourselves, our Black selves, and all that we are, even if that means we have to do it outside of an institution, right, that don't want to do it.
And what does that look like practically for me, right? And thank you for that point about the woman. We were in Dr. Coleman's study on Monday night talking about this, and somebody said a woman wrapped clothes around the spirit so the spirit could show up. That blessed me real good. But when we think about the practical manifestations, right, of the liturgy in worship, what does it look like? Because oftentimes we are so stuck, and thank you for Dr. Alan McLaurin for showing us where order of service comes from, right? But order of service has become an idol in many of our contexts that we can't deviate from. And so we don't make room for denouncing and debunking the spirit-flesh dichotomy in very practical ways. So, I'm just gonna give you examples from our church at Rise, right? When someone joins our community, the first thing that I do is I look that person in their eyes and I say, there is nothing wrong with you.
That's correct.
Not fix yourself, not you need to be saved from this, that, and the other. There is nothing wrong with you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image and God's likeness. And that's so important because people come with church trauma. And they come, those who were churched, from being beat up on for who they are. And if not, even folks who didn't grow up in the church just have these challenges around ontological Blackness, right? And worth and worthiness. And so, changing how we receive people in our language and in our embrace, right? And embracing their full embodied selves. And then I pass the mic to that person and I say, you tell us who you are. Right? I don't need a church clerk to do that. Name yourself and speak your name in an act of self-determination into this body, right? So that's one example. But another example I want to give, because I feel like it was a little off the grid. We go a little on the wild side. is one Sunday I preached about the electric slide and about the evolutions of the electric slide that have happened over many years, right? We got so many slides now, we probably can't keep up with them, right? The wobble and everything else. But I went through those and talked about that as evolutionary Black genius that always connects the entire community wherever we are, right? I said, but we can't stop there. And so what I did in our worship is I had us create our own slide. Right in the middle of the worship service, I invited persons to come and to create movements. And we connected those movements and learned them together as a congregation. Right? And came out with a new African embodied experience of worship and said, and it's not separate from worship. This is our worship. Our movement is our worship. That was the genius of Baby Suggs Holy, right?
That's correct.
Is that, you know, after they worked hard all day, many who escaped incredible, unthinkable horrors, they were affirmed in their movement, in their laughter, in their crying, be in these bodies and create and move. And so for me, that's what Womanist liturgy looks like and does.
Ashe. And I'm a living testimony that that is what you as pastor and we as members do at Rise. It is so liberative and transformative, but it is also risky. It is risky. And I want to say that to us who are here and those who are watching, to incorporate, to embody a new liturgical paradigm. It's risky. I'm not making any qualms about that. I'm not going to sugarcoat it for anyone. To write this lecture was risky for me because I don't just exist in the academy as a scholar. I also live in the church. And so to say to
the church,
listen here, and
colored methods.
Colored. Reverend, I need us to be colored. Christian is all right, but we got to recover coloredness. But why I am so determined and dedicated to this liberative transformative paradigm is because I see Black folk being the victims of liturgical paradigms that were built to destroy us. And worship is not supposed to do that. It's supposed to build up the body. We said we're supposed to, what we do is supposed to edify us. It's supposed to build us, transform us. But you can't get transformed if you've been told all the world you evil and you ugly and you're nothing, and your liturgies proclaim that you are unworthy crumb, you a worm, you a wretch, undone. And so that's why I advocate for this recovering of these ancestral cosmologies, these ancestral liturgies, because that is exactly what our ancestors dealt with, went through, transmogrified themselves, if I can use that word. And as we prepare to come to the final topic at hand, so as I was doing, and part of what was the impetus behind this lecture is because of this notion that the Black church, if we can use that, we know the Black church is not monolithic, but the Black church has been left out, decentered of many of our prophetic communal movements in the last few decades, particularly as we see in the latter part of the 20th and first part of the 21st century. And so what would we say to those of us in the Black church, those who have some connection with the Black church, of using this paradigm to recover prophetic and communal authority, not just to get people back in the church. That's not what I'm saying. But to influence in spiritually life-giving ways present-day social justice movements. What would we say?
Yes, just quickly. I think, again, we have to recover, and as Dr. Handy and others are suggesting, we cover and we also revise our cosmology. One of the most beautiful things about embodiment is that in West African cosmology, the symbol for that is the gourd. The gourd is very physical, and it's a representation of everything is inside of the gourd. And that things work on the basis of cause and effect. They work on the basis of Iwa Pele, good character. And so as we reconstruct our own cosmology and we construct our own liturgies, our own unique liturgies, that is the examples are just given. That's inclusive of everything. Saturday night and Sunday morning are the same in different forms. Let's say that again. They're the same in different forms. They're the full expression of who we are. And we take that right and opportunity to define our own reality and be futuristic. And this is the other thing. Our children are showing us the way. The future is not behind us. The future is not in front of us. It's behind us. It's our children. So we also follow, if they're ancestors who've returned, we need to listen to what it is that they are showing us. We need to ask them, what do they see? Where are they going? And walk along with them. Follow that same model that the universe is dialogical. It's dialogical. We can do that. Then we'll have new forms of liturgies that we can't even imagine yet. Because the imagination is in their minds. And they've come back to show us the new way.
Actually.
And can I answer that very briefly, Dr. McLaurin? You said, Dr. Coleman, we have the power, we have the agency to create new cosmologies, right? We also have the agency to destroy old myths, right? And to make new myths that mean us, that old myths that mean us no good, right? Old myths that demonize, right, our Blackness, old myths that built this whole, modern arrangement, right? We have the power to do that. And I'm thankful that I have found and that others are finding this whole Afrofuturist movement, right, gives us the language and the agency and the tools to do just that, to challenge myths that are presented to us as normative, right, as normal, as natural, right, as natural is what I'm saying. And so, yes, Dr. Coleman, we have the power to create new cosmologies and also challenge and destroy old myths that lock us into where we are right now, right? And make it seem as though all this is natural and it's not.
And to your earlier point, if we have Olarishas and Ofodoom that don't serve us, we don't need them. Let's be clear. If we have old Vodun, Olarishas that don't serve us now, we don't need them.
Actually.
Yeah, and we can't be afraid to leave spaces, right? That uphold these things. And so one of my issues right now is, okay, I'm in this system, right, that in many ways upholds all this, right? In many ways, and it's dying because it chooses to uphold these dangerous things, right? It's dying. I don't want no part of that. I don't affirm that, right? So yes, amen and ashe. This is good. Praise the Lord, saints.
Amen. Yes, the myths. And I want to push the myths, since we're talking about the church, in the biblical text that we also don't need. We come on out of this Randy Bailey school right here.
Ashe.
You asked this question, and I think it was from your lecture because I put it in my notes. How liberated and whole would congregations become if people no longer had to reconcile opposing views of God as loving and cruel, right? These opposing views, but those opposing deities are in the text. So first of all, we have to examine which deity we're talking about when we're reading the Bible. Because they show up in different ways, different manifestations of personality and ways of being, right? And then do we have the authority as we mine that text, or better said, the courage, right, to say sometimes the problem isn't just the interpretation of the text, but it is the text.
Correct.
And be all right with saying that.
Yeah.
Because that shapes our meaning making, and there's some toxic stuff in that text, right? That has, created our toxic ways of seeing ourselves and our realities. And so we have to be able to be honest in talking about that, right? And in saying it, and not feel like we lost our Jesus and our faith when we do. I grew up thinking, the book of Revelation was it. You don't add no words to this, so you going to hell. You know what I'm saying? That kind of understanding,
Right.
versus God is still creating, and so are we, and we are called to be in that co-creating possibility. And so, yeah.
I say.
No, that's a good point, Dr. Henny, and you all know that I'm on that wagon there. That is text and context. And we actually, from my point of view, are the first generation that have the opportunity to read something like the original text. Our ancestors were not allowed to read for a reason. And even when we read translations that are done by others, those translations are vested and interested in a particular way. So the opportunity to read our own text or read the text for ourselves, and then to read the broader context outside of the canon that we've received is imperative. And again, to make the decisions, well, which of these narratives actually are relevant for us and which ones are not, and to let them go that are not.
Ashe. Ooh, this has been so good.
Your masters, because we got that one.
Wait, say that again, Doc.
The slaves be obedient to your masters. That's the one that we usually jump to, not realizing that there are a multiplicity of other narratives.
Correct.
That need to engage in the same way and with the same.
That's correct.
Or disposal.
Ashe. Well, this has been just unbelievably rich and full and provocative. It has provided us questions that we will continue to engage in the days, weeks, months, even years to come. I pray that those of you who have been watching, that you have engaged and been able to hear with new ears and hear this wisdom and this scholarship that takes us on forward, which is the job of scholarship. It is not merely to look back, but it is also to look forward. I want to thank so very much our panelists, the Reverend Dr. Maisha E.T.R. Kariamu-Handy, the Reverend Dr. Baba Will Coleman, and Reverend Amber Louisa Lowe Woodfork for their work, for their scholarship, for their wonderful commentary, for their pushing me to dig even deeper in research and scholarship, and to bridge that with what is going on in the church. I want to thank our president, Reverend Matthew Wesley Williams, our interim provost, Dr. Reginaldo P. Braga, our excellent, wonderful administration, our just divine faculty, our beautiful staff, and our beloved students. And I want to thank Ms. Katrina Garnes, Ms. Angel Parks, and Reverend Jeremiah Hackley for all of their work today. Thank you all so very much. Yes, we remember our ancestors, call their names, remember them, remember the wisdom that they left with you. And as always, keep ITC in your hearts, in your minds, and alumni, please support. Friends of the ITC, please support. We thank you, we bless you. God keep you.